Hello, fellow griever. This is the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I am Melissa, your host. This week, you have found yourself with me for one of my shorter, solo, down the rabbit hole episodes. Here, I take you with me on a journey of sorts, through thoughts in my own griefy mind. Some days, I may tackle topics as if I am in Alice's shoes, slaying the Jabberwocky. And on others, I may end up in my own pool of tears. Or I may just go a bit sideways and paint the proverbial roses red. But I always promise an adventure. So let's dive down the rabbit hole and see just what sorts of madness we might discover together. I am glad you have joined me, because while I do know how lonely this grief is, I also believe we needn't be alone. Welcome. Hello and welcome, fellow griever. This is Season 5, Episode 21 of the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I'm Melissa, your host. Today is part 3 of a 3-part series I've just done over the last 10 or 12 days, and parts 1 and 2 are already out. I suggest listening to them in order, so if you have not listened to parts 1 or 2 of this 3-part series, they are immediately ahead of this one, and you can find them in order in my queue. And like I said, they are sequential in the way they're put together, so they are relevant to listen to that way. If you find that you're catching this one out of order, just make sure you know that. The title of this one is Can Words Kill Us? Or Can Words Kill, I think. And what now? So it's the big what now, like what now from this podcast? Meaning, what do I want to impart to you? Why did I do this? What do I think you can take from it? You know, the big what now after this. You know, in other words, you've aired out what you think. You've told us all these different thoughts and facts and theories. And is it just for information or is it for something else? So what I'm going to discuss, if you want to be weighing out what's going to be coming at you in this episode, is exactly what I just said. How relevant is this to you as the audience? Statistics that are relevant in the suicide loss world. Suicide and others, meaning when there is someone else either directly or indirectly involved in your loved one's suicide. How does this look from a legal standpoint? Which is a lot of what we'll concentrate on in this episode. And then I will talk about being outspoken or being an advocate. What does that look like? How do we do it? How could we collaborate and come together? In other words, my concluding thoughts. So that's what I'm going to cover. And I want to get started with exactly, so I titled this The Rest of My Story, and then each episode had a different subtitle. And as I told you, the subtitle of this one is Can Words Kill? And what now? So the reason I did this series, although I believe I've only scratched the surface of potential reasons and things I could talk about, I wanted to be able to tell the rest of my story. But I also, and on a greater level, that's the reason for wanting to tell it, is to bring awareness. I want to create a spark that ignites a fire. Or be that big drip that goes into the big pond that creates a huge ripple effect so that it can keep going and keep going. I'm going to start first with, by talking about how this is relevant to us and how it's relevant to you, my audience, because it's always my first consideration. I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics. I don't do that very often on the podcast. And if you're like me, a lot of times you're not paying attention to any of the statistics that closely because we're paying attention to our own loss, as we should be, right? And so I'll start back 11 years ago in 2013. CDC's numbers were kind of like this, and I'm going to keep them real simple for an audio podcast. But for all of these three statistics I'm going to read, less than 1% of this applied to adults. So anybody over the age, I think, of 24 for what they consider an adult for these statistics. Less than 1% of adults died by suicide, as opposed to 8% of high school kids. 13% of those high school kids reported planning a suicide, and 17%, y'all, that's really close to 20%, or 1 in 5, have seriously considered suicide. And again, all three of those statistics for adults is under 1%. So that's a vast difference in when we start talking about the suicide rate in young people increasing so dramatically. And all that feeds right into the next one. So between the ages of 5, and they have to just categorize these by ages. So for this, it's hard to say 5. I'll say 10. Between the ages of 10 and 24, suicide is now the second cause of death, behind only accidental deaths, which is always the number one reason for deaths. And ages 24 to 44, the next 2 decades, it's the fourth leading cause. So this is considered in a group where they're talking about the top 5 reasons. They're not talking about top 10 or whatever. They're talking about top 5. So between the ages of 5 and 44, so for that 40-year span, it's either the second leading cause now or the fourth leading cause, which is a huge jump from where it's been in the past. So, and still statistically, males die almost 4% more often today than females, although female suicide is still on the increase and increased from where it's been in the past. So don't let those numbers not let you think it's not a crisis for both males and females, because it is. But the between the two, it seems to be getting a little bit broader of a distance, that the men are dying even more than before. So in 2022, the United States saw about 50,000 deaths by suicide. Overall, from 2000 to 2020, so that's only 2 decades, it went from suicide being the 12th overall leading cause of death to being the 10th overall leading cause of death in the United States. That was a 2016 number. So that means in those 2 decades, we've had a 36% increase. 2 decades, 36% increase in suicide. And I want everybody to consider that that's taking into account that the numbers are not always as accurate as we'd like them to be. Stigma plays into that a lot due to due to the stigmas. It plays a role in numbers not being accurately reported. They can be misreported for many reasons. Sometimes it's even unknown, the real reason. So you can see a crossover between overdose and accidental deaths and things potentially being misreported, as well as things being misreported for reasons that are buried underneath the stigma of suicide. There was a big spike going into 2014. I will tell you that. And all it did when I looked up these statistics is confirm what I already knew, that Alex's suicide in 2016 was near the beginning of this curve upwards, meaning I was just starting to kind of catch on that we were having more suicides in youth than normal when Alex died, but it wasn't something we were prevalently or readily hearing about. It was still just kind of beginning to tick up a little bit. But since his death, there's been many times I've gone, is it just me? Because I live in a world now that is shrouded in suicide loss. Is it just me that feels like it's greatly increasing? And the statistics confirmed what I already knew, which is it's not just me. It did take a turn up in 2014 significantly and has continued to rise ever since then, with the exception of the CDC is reporting that there was actually a brief drop in the numbers in 2018 and 19, which was interesting. But by 2022, the numbers had ticked back up to where they were previously. So even though there was a real brief dip, it went back up. And from looking at what I can see from the numbers, this is not an official thing that I'm saying here. This is my opinion. But from what I've seen, my opinion is that at least briefly when we all went into global lockdown, that it might actually have helped reduce the numbers of suicide. Because in looking at the charts that I did, it went into the beginnings of the pandemic of 2020 and 2021. And so I think we saw a brief dip because people were coming together more. Many people, while some people were isolated, many people were also with families. And just by sheer numbers of people living under the same roof, I think there may have been a bit of a dip. But then we also saw, as the pandemic grew, a lot of more people became isolated, mental health got worse, all those things. And it very quickly spiked back up to where it was. And now the trend is that, of course, as we are all seeing, it's continuing to rise. Now, if we get into the statistics of the legality, which I'm not going to other than to say that suicide has not been illegal in the United States since it's been well over 100 years. I think 1910 was the last time suicide was illegal in the United States. And that sounds almost silly to say out loud, but suicide is still considered illegal in quite a few countries and places in Africa, as well as parts of Asia. And yes, you'd be talking about, like with Asia, I'm sure some of this is communist countries and things, but keep in mind there's a lot of those statistics we don't know. So some of it is still cultural. But when you start talking about the law on suicide, I just thought it would be good to lead with that, which, getting away from the idea of the suicide itself being illegal is part of why the rhetoric, the words of died by suicide versus committed is actually important, because when we hear the word committed, it harkens back to the idea of committing a crime, committing a homicide, and it puts into our mind that preconceived kind of ill feeling about suicide being something that may be of a malice versus what we know it to be true, which is, a broken moment in a brain. That's a simplification, a way oversimplification, but it's for the sake of this argument, that's the way I'm going to put that. Okay, so for me, sharing the rest of my story in part helps because it highlights a part of the suicide crisis in young people that's avoided often and talked around or ignored or put off as something else. And what I would ask is it possible that there's a greater stigma than suicide itself? And I think, embedded just below the surface of many of our children's deaths are situations like mine. Situations where there may have been somebody else directly or indirectly involved in your loved one's suicide, and yet bringing it up or talking about it somehow makes you one of many things. It maybe makes you someone who's not willing to accept that their child died by suicide, according to others. It may be someone who is just wanting to find somebody to blame, according to others. It might be somebody that's just vindictive and looking for, a reason to go after somebody. There's all these reasons that people come up with in their mind, and some of it's just a fear factor. I have come to find out that if the rest of the world, the people that are not directly affected by suicide, if they really stop and understand a lot of these things, it makes their world feel unsafe. It makes it feel like suicide could somehow be possible in their world. So they like to keep our reality as something that's so far out of reach for them that it couldn't possibly ever touch their life. And that's where this part of even the culpability on a part of others even factors in, because these people want to just shake their heads and say, oh, that poor mom, she can't just accept that her, child was troubled and, drug addicted and all the things that they really quickly point out. And had mental health problems and all the things that they want to point to, instead of, and then if you point at, somebody else's involvement potentially being a factor, it just gets brushed off. As I've even heard these exact words of somebody else's words cannot influence us to do something, feel something, or act a certain way as drastic as ending our life, especially. And I would argue greatly against that. And there's proof in the world to the contrary. But, that may be an argument for another day. So, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the place that I'm going to go with this is that I'm going to dip in and out of an article called Speech and Suicide, the Line of Legality. I'm going to dip in and out of reading parts of that and giving my thoughts or opinions on it, and then I'll wrap up here towards the end. This episode probably is not going to be as long as the last two, but it doesn't mean it's not packed with just as much thought as them, if not as much times 10, because I feel like there's an awful lot to take in here. So I mentioned this article called Speech and Suicide. It's an online article that I, of course, have linked in the show notes, called The Line of Legality. And it's in the American Journal of Law and Medicine through Cambridge Core's program. It was just published 4 months ago in the Cambridge University American Journal of Law and Medicine online. And the article is written by Justine Newman. And I'm going to start by briefly discussing what became an unprecedented ruling in an unprecedented case from 2017. And it was a case of Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter, and I know it's one most of us have heard about. And just as a side note, for the rest of this episode, just know that I did take a lot of facts from the internet, of course, so not claiming dates or specifics to be my own. It's information that I've extrapolated from very public places. But a lot of the legal stuff that I'll be talking about and reading quotes from is coming from that article that I mentioned called Speech and Suicide, the Line of Legality, from that American Journal of Law and Medicine in Cambridge online. And so I'm going to just start talking about this very unprecedented ruling in an incredible case that occurred in 2017. On July 12th of 2014, an 18-year-old young man named Conrad Roy drove to a Kmart parking lot, assembled a gasoline-powered water pump in his back seat of his truck, and poisoned himself with carbon monoxide. In the weeks leading up to Roy's death, his 17-year-old girlfriend, Michelle Carter, researched methods for committing suicide, pressured him, and counseled him to overcome his fears. Rather than mitigating the danger or rendering aid, however, she allowed him to proceed, later texting a friend saying, "I could have easily stopped him or called the police, but I didn't." Taking advantage of Roy's diminished capacity for choice and subsequently failing to rescue, Carter's words, her own words, played an integral role in his death. The Commonwealth argued that Carter's wanton and reckless conduct resulted in the likelihood that substantial harm would come to another, thereby satisfying the elements for involuntary manslaughter. Based on the determination of a reasonable person would have realized that they could have influenced Roy to kill himself. Carter was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in juvenile court in Massachusetts. Now, just as a side note here, she did not do very much time. She was in, from what I remember, under a year. She had got like 18 months or something and then got out for, good behavior. We have a broken justice system, y'all, but it was unprecedented, and it was really important that it happened because it takes, just that one pebble sometimes, right? Would Carter's liability in Roy's death differ if she instead gave him a book and bookmarked the chapter on carbon monoxide poisoning? While Roy had already found information online regarding carbon monoxide as a potential suicide method, Carter shared additional research as to how effectively to take his own life. What if she relayed him to a pro-suicide website that did the same thing. So the author says that the cyber environment facilitates this public health problem, and steps should be taken to mitigate further assisted suicides. This must be done carefully, however, as not to chill the freedom of speech and violate the First Amendment. By simply identifying more precisely where the line of criminal liability for encouraging or assisting suicide falls, there may be a positive effect on public health. For instance, someone may think twice about helping a friend commit suicide if they are aware of the consequences. And I will put a link to this paper in the show notes. I think I've already told you that. I've also linked to the original essay that I wrote that started this whole 3-part series, as well as linking to 2 advocates that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. The areas that I'm going to highlight are the areas that they highlight in the paper, and then I'm going to briefly highlight each of these areas. In section 2, they provide an explanation of suicide assistance as a public health issue. By suicide assistance, I mean people that either directly or indirectly somehow assist in the suicide of another. And so this person wrote this article. That's why this is so relevant. So if you don't hear anything else, hear that I'm telling you to look at the link, click the link, and go read it for yourself, because in case hearing it sounds confusing, looking at the paper and reading it in its entirety will absolutely clarify what I'm talking about. And this suicide assistance as a public health issue. So we're talking about the increased risk of a suicide attempt supports the needed for stricter restrictions and pro-suicide speech. And a person contemplating suicide may follow through when given directions or support from an outside force, because those who assist with suicide intervene at a critical tipping point. Their involvement poses a perilous scenario. Now, you guys, I feel like I have to read that a couple of times, like in my head, just to at least I did when I first came across this paper, because this is so relevant. It's only a few months ago, so it's very timely. It means that people on the outside, not just those of us living inside of this crisis, but people on the outside are starting to see that not only is young suicide a crisis, but so are people that are intervening or assisting at the time of what they call a tipping point here. I'll call a critical vulnerability point. And I'll talk a little bit about the whole perfect storm scenario that I think is being addressed here without them using those exact words. But that's the way I see it. So that's section 2. In section 3 of the paper, she addresses assisting suicide as a crime. So in other words, how do you look at people that intervene or assist directly in suicide as a crime? Because as I already talked about in the first part, obviously they're addressing how this can be a sticking point. One of the biggest sticking points is we have to be really careful about violation of the First Amendment, because as we know with many other things in the First Amendment, you have to be careful of what you're willing to give up in one arena that might cause you to lose that same right or privilege in all the other arenas. So we know it's tricky, the First Amendment thing, right? So in section 3, when they talk about how do you treat it as a crime, in that section, they provide examples of first, what is physical assistance, which it's actually murder. It's homicide, not suicide. They talk about 2, by remote communications. And that's what applied to the Commonwealth versus Carter, the manslaughter charge. So in other words, people that directly, but not with them, someone that's remote, either on the phone, over video, over text, that kind of thing, and assists in the suicide. They talk about static publications or books or online. And there's going to be a part that I bring up about 5 last acts, and that's no crime. So in the course, so there's these 3 different levels of crime. You can have somebody who physically actually assists, which then makes it actual murder, not homicide or not suicide, which initially some homicides can appear to be a suicide. They're made to look that way on purpose. So that's why the investigation's important, among other things. remote communications, which would be somebody who directly is telling somebody to do something. And then there's just books and online forums that always have the disclaimers in them that protect them legally. And there's no crime in our current law system for this type of thing, which is terrifying because, I'll just briefly say that I have learned through researching this that there are all sorts of online forums that encourage suicide, and there seems to be no regulation about them because they all have put the right little small print, if you will, in, and it gets them off the hook, even though that's the whole purpose of these forums, is to encourage people to take their lives. So the fourth point is a distinction between 2 and 3, which would be a distinction between manslaughter and no crime committed. So while homicide requires direct causation, we know that there has to be a direct cause. Somebody actually caused the death for homicide. To satisfy the assisting suicide statutes, intention or knowledge is typically required. So in that case, somebody that knows they're causing this damage or could potentially be causing the outcome. And so in the book, Last 5 Acts, that is addressed in the article, and it's just a book on how to end your life, because the author doesn't know who's reading the book or why they're reading it. If Michelle Carter had provided a copy of that book to him, and that's all she did, is there any way that could be criminalized, right? That's what this kind of asks. Is providing a gun for a suicide different than providing a book with step-by-step instructions? And so that's what I'm talking about. There's such a fine line with some of this, because I've often said things like, if somebody had been standing next to Alex on the top of a high space and they pushed him, they would undoubtedly be liable for his death. It would be murder. But if somebody is involved at the time that he is essentially at the edge of a ledge, emotionally or mentally, and they provide that, are they also liable? And that's where this gray area comes in, right? Is, having to try to prove the frame of mind of that other person. Are they just providing a book, or are they actually handing them a weapon? And is it even wrong to hand them a weapon? There's a case that I read about where somebody actually did that, provided the weapon to their spouse that they knew was suicidal. They didn't directly, supposedly, tell them what to do. They just provided the weapon. And of course, this came out in a court case where all these things were questioned. But because they provided the weapon knowing that their spouse was suicidal, they were found to have some responsibility in the fact. So this article goes on to discuss, recently journalists with the New York Times investigated one particular website that could be linked to at least 45 members' deaths. The website receives roughly, ready for this? It's horrible, 6 million monthly views. And half of its members are under 25 years old. You guys are so much in this. I get that there's so many branches to this rabbit hole that we could go down with this, because this could obviously take us off in directions that have to do, that are all these peripheral and yet integral things that include social media and how early people have access, how kids have access to computers, all the different things that we know has changed in the last couple decades. But that statistic alone is alarming. That means over 3 million views on this website a month are young people under the age of 25 years old. Among the most viewed posts are goodbye threads that are documenting suicides in real time. I'm pausing on purpose because I almost can't believe that exists. However, like Docker in Last 5 Acts, the site comes with a disclaimer: do not assist or encourage. A few words gets them off the hook, you guys, just a few words. Instead, users are instructed to provide factual information and emotional support without assistance. Causality of death is severed, leaving the only opportunity for liability to be through the criminalization of providing information, which then dips into our rights in this country, right? We cannot criminalize free access to information. So it's a slippery slope that we would have a broad chilling effect on free speech if we looked at criminalizing this. So how can we? I mean, even as a mother of a child lost to suicide, I ask, how can we? We can't, how do you infringe upon free speech in this country on that level? The chilling effect should not be taken lightly, as this author says, though it must be balanced with consideration that the primary users of the website are a vulnerable population and that the state always has an interest in protecting human life. That's the unwinding of this. That's somewhere in here lies the wisdom, but to get to something that we can act on is going to be hard. I'm going to say that part again. They say the chilling effect should not be taken lightly, though it must be balanced with consideration that the primary users of this website are a vulnerable population and that the state always has an interest in protecting human life. The internet makes these instructions available with just a few clicks, and those contemplating suicide may act irrationally if given the information at just the right time. Thought must be given as to how to intercept this fatal combination without infringing upon an author's rights to free speech. Okay, that's section 4, or 3. That's a big section. Keep in mind, I'm only giving you little tiny pieces of this article. I tried to pick out the parts that really highlighted what the article was about. So in section 4, they go on to explain the First Amendment protections of pro-suicide speech. And there's a lot in the paragraph, but it ends, one of the paragraphs in section 4 ends with this. Because of the nature of the speech and severity of the consequences, pro-suicide books and websites should be viewed with seriousness and skepticism. Suicide is a hefty price to pay for First Amendment freedom for the select few who choose to write about it. However, pro-suicide speech cannot be outlawed in its entirety. Even if authors aim to educate and empower, suicide is a public health problem that can be exacerbated by the accessibility of these writings. For those who are contemplating suicide, an easy-to-follow guide might just be what is needed to make that decision. Liability should be reserved for those situations where there is this case. So that section 4 unwinds that whole scenario right there, right? Talking about First Amendment rights and how this person believes we have to do something. In her last paragraph, she says while criminalization of behavior does not always deter it, there is a public health interest in preventing suicide and the assistance of it. Though suicide itself is no longer considered a crime, as it was in the medieval England, aiding in another's death quickly approaches the line of murder. As the law exists now, it may be difficult to hold participants accountable, especially those acting through books and pro-suicide websites. Because these are growing in popularity, there is a cause for concern. But before implementing broader laws with more relaxed mens rea, for instance, there may be a bioethical discussion as to whether that is correct solution for the problem. Any encroachment on the First Amendment would need to be done mindfully. Lastly, as a public health problem, targeting the individual may not achieve the health outcomes that we seek, as there are a host of unique situations that could make their way into the legal system. For now, simply identifying the line of legality and spreading awareness of the issue could have a deterrent effect, but further action must be taken soon. So I'm going to read that again because I know I did that a minute ago, but there's so much impact in that statement. For now, she says, simply identifying the line of legality and spreading awareness of the issue could have a deterrent effect, but further action must be taken soon. So she believes in the imminent danger of not taking action. She believes there should be a deterrent in place legally, and that, yeah, obviously, continuing to spread awareness, which is part of what I'll talk about in a minute. So I want to say I feel encouraged that we can make a difference somehow by telling stories, by me telling this story, by you telling your story in some way that you want to tell it, encouraging that others, encourage that others are listening. But it's hard. I feel like it's a snail's greatest race to a far-off destination across a huge salt flat. Like, that's what it feels like to me, but that doesn't mean it's not possible, right? To quote one of my son's favorite actors from a movie, so it's possible? Yes, it is possible, but we have to persist. We have to draw attention to these things first. And things like this article are doing that. Things like me talking about this and telling my story is doing that. Highlighting, illustrating, reminding, getting up on our soapboxes. That's how we affect a change. That's how we let others know that the situation exists and implore them to become involved. We have to destroy stigmas. We must start to destigmatize talking about mental health and suicide loss. And for goodness gracious, we have to destigmatize grieving in general. We have to empower each other, our communities, our societies, our loved ones to be advocates for their own mental wellness. We have to change the dialogue around mental wellness and make it as important as physical wellness. We have to advocate for mind, body, and spiritual wellness. We can't just ask if we're well and mean physical health. We have to also mean mental health and spiritual health, and we have to have no dividing lines. It needs to be treated as a whole. We've proven that we do better as a human if we treat our wellness as a whole body wellness and not just compartmentalize it. So when I talked about being willing to be people that come out and speak and draw attention to and talk about, I want to briefly talk about a couple of the people that I know in this community of suicide loss that are doing just that. And one of them has an online forum called Curator of Quotes on Instagram. She's an outspoken mom who advocates for kindness and speaks up openly, exposing the bullying situation that was involved in the death of her son. She also has no problem talking about and dealing with the seedy underbelly of the Catholic Church and the part that this played in her son's death, as well as social media. And she's using social media conversely now as a powerful platform to hashtag flip the culture, hashtag be brave enough to be kind. Those are her two main hashtags. And she uses them repeatedly, consistently, and persistently to try to flip the culture on how we look at bullying and toxic leadership and all of these things that are contributing to the loss of life of our own kids. So another amazing family that I want to talk about are friends of mine who lost their son to suicide, and then he was active duty military and was victim to toxic leadership in the military. And they now run a nonprofit specifically to help provide anonymous telehealth mental health sessions to active and retired military to support their mental health, hopefully before it gets to a crisis stage. That's how they've responded to this. And they're just two examples. I've linked to both of them in the show notes, but they're two shining examples of parents who have lost paid the greatest price that any parent should ever pay, and are perfect examples of, just like my son's case, what I kind of call the perfect storm of events that come together. And we're starting to see more and more this evidence that without all the elements of a perfect storm, that we wouldn't have the last 2 decades of statistics, and specifically the last, decade of statistics of how alarming the rate is going up. Because to me, a perfect storm by definition means that usually 2 or 3 or 4 parts have to come together in just the most perfect, unnatural way or unlikely way in order to affect a result. So that means, they can say what they want about the young men in Kirksville, my son included. Were there problems with their mental health? Was there love life problems? Were there school problems? Were there parent problems? All these things that we know young people have in general. But then did you have somebody involved, and did you have agencies and or people involved that could have intervened and didn't? So did you have all these perfect things come together at the right time, that if we had more things in place, just one of these things by definition being knocked out of play, the perfect storm doesn't occur. And that's what we see over and over again, is that when one of these things is removed from play, it's hard for the storm to play out, that something will set the course off path. So before I dismount the pedestal that I know I'm up on, I want to say that I did this because, like I've said several times, I believe that something similar to what happened to me is a part of so many of our stories, or something that's similar to what's happened to Curator of Quotes or what's happened to Hicks Strong. I believe that there are so many more people out there that have the element of another person as the piece that made their perfect storm happen. And there's a statistic that I didn't talk about. I know we kind of indirectly talked about other publications and online forums. So we're talking about, we have a vulnerable person that may or may not have some or all of the things we discussed: addictions, depression, life troubles, ongoing mental health struggles, different things like these, some of which or all could be playing into their vulnerability. And then you add into it 1 or 2 key elements that cause the storm to really spin and become a potential life-threatening problem. And that usually involves just a couple of possible areas. It involves either a publication or online forum that may encourage them one direction. It may include a physical person's involvement or persons' involvement in making that happen. And something we didn't touch base on, but I feel like is relevant to mention, is access to firearms, because firearms are responsible for the loss of life to suicide almost 60% of the time. That's a big statistic. And out of gun deaths, period, out of all the gun deaths out there, more than 50% of them are by gun. So those sound like the same statistic, but they're not. I won't go over them again because I don't want to add insult to injury and keep repeating those things. And I am not by any means interjecting my political views into this at all, other than to say that I feel like our gun laws need to be looked at. That is not me saying I personally believe that we need to outlaw or ban guns. I don't want to dip into anybody's amendment rights. I'm simply saying the statistics and the facts back up the fact that there's something wrong, and we by far are the country that has the greatest problem with guns, and I'm not going to get up on that pedestal today, as far as knowing that that's a problem in the suicide loss community. So talking about it, communicating, speaking up is something that I'm advocating for, but I do want to say that even if you can't do it now, it's okay. It's okay. I'm 8 years in. I didn't do it until now as far as this part. I have been telling, obviously, my story. I've been telling about the loss of my son and my son's amazing life and my journey and all the things. But I haven't told the rest of the story up until now because I wasn't able to for many reasons. But now I am. So my point is, if it's not the right time, I'm not asking you to try to force yourself. Your own well-being and your own healing journey comes first. But we all have to do it in our own time, right? And I believe that when we do, we can make a change somehow, some way. Together, there's the key. Together, we can get there, right? Because just living in today's world is hard. I don't know how anybody does it alone. They don't. The suicide rates are part of that evidence, right? We need each other. And before I give you my very last final words, I'm going to read a poem by an author, a female author named Kyle York. And I'm reading this directly from the Curator of Quotes website. She has this woman's poem pinned at the very beginning of her feed. It says, sometimes in the face of great tragedy, you will have to be brave enough to accept that the pain is already changing you. The journey has taken a shift. Your life has changed and you will never be the same. Life hands us those moments, and most of the time we have no idea why it had to happen to us, or even how we're going to handle it, because it hurts. It punched a hole straight through your heart, leaving you with an empty space that could never be replaced. But we learn how to live with it. We may heal, but some holes can't be filled with what once was, and that is okay to hold space for the love that deserves to stay. I love that poem, but I hate that I have a reason to love it, if you know what I mean. So just as the author said, our journey has taken a shift. She's right. We didn't ask for this, but our life's never going to be the same. And because of that, I will personally continue to show up here and support and provide resources and connections and ask for a hand and offer a hand and bring awareness and do all of the things in this suicide loss space as long as I'm here. I will do it from my very specific Alex-sized hole in this mama's heart. If you feel led to connect with me for any reason, whether that be from this 3-part series or anything else I discuss or anything new you would like to approach me with, please feel free to reach out at melissa@theleftoverpieces.com. Please like and follow and share the podcast so that we can reach a greater audience. I never used to ask that, but now I know I should, because there are so many people like us out there needing to connect, needing to find a way through the darkness. And I believe together we can do that for each other. And I don't want to end without saying how immensely grateful I am for those of you that have taken the time to listen to all 3 of these episodes, and especially those of you that know how very hard it was for me to start this conversation and to be vulnerable enough to put the rest of my story out there and to say all these things. Thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if you are led to connect with me or get involved in any way, or even just have a question, never hesitate to reach out to melissa@theleftoverpieces.com. I'll be thinking of you and your loved one. Be gentle with yourself and take good care. Talk soon, fellow reader. So we'll conclude here for today, but I just wanted to say a few things before you go. If you're new to the podcast and have not listened to the very first episode called Intro Episodes Start Here, all the way back at the beginning of Season 1, I would encourage you to do so that you know what to expect from the Leftover Pieces, because I do have several different styles of episodes that I record, and we do release weekly, almost all of the time. So I hope that you will come back often to join us in this community of suicide loss survivors. If you have not already, also, I would encourage you to check out theleftoverpieces.com, where you can find and have access to all of the things that I currently offer. Some of those things are online Zoom support groups, links to my books, educational opportunities that I'm adding all the time, as well as different downloadables, and resources for all suicide loss survivors. And if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, or you'd just like to connect with me for any other reason, you can do it through the website as well. So until next time, I just want to remind you that I know how lonely this grief is, but you don't have to be alone. Talk soon.